It's 1896. Africa is under full-scale invasion by Europe. Across the continent, European flags are being planted, spreading from land to land. Lands that had belonged to African kingdoms, empires, communities, and rulers for generations. Meanwhile, in European capitals, new borders across the African interior are being sketched on paper maps, with every territory captured. European armies are moving, advancing from coastlines into the African interior, and one region after another being pulled into the expanding reach of European power. Britain is advancing, France is advancing, Germany is advancing, Portugal is holding on to all the climbs, Belgium has seized the Congo, Italy too has entered the race, pushing into the Horn of Africa, determined not to be left behind, while other European powers declare colonies across the continent. And everywhere across Africa, African societies are desperately trying to resist. Kings negotiating, warriors fighting, communities mobilizing, rising to defend their lands, African armies coming together, hurriedly gathering. Time is running out. Spears, shields, rifles, fortresses, treaties, and diplomacy are all being brought into the struggle for sovereignty. But still, the colonial advance continues. African territory after African territory falling. African resistance after African resistance being overwhelmed by massive European armies and mighty weaponry. The African map keeps changing, and with each passing treaty and resistance falling, more of Africa is pulled under Europe's grip. By mid-1890s, the land grab of Africa by Europe is no longer a wish. It is happening on the ground. The continent is being captured, being reshaped. Europe is confident. Resistance by Africans could only delay the inevitable. Total capture and colonization of Africa was for sure. And then, just when Europe thought they had it all under control, the reports begin to arrive. At first, they're unbelievable. It could not be true. It should not have happened. A European army had been defeated in the Horn of Africa, defeated outright by an African resistance in open battle. The defeat had been a crushing one. A European power, its soldiers killed, some captured, and others scattered. Its colonizing ambitions collapsed on the battlefield. The news spreads quickly across Europe. The defeat is studied with disbelief, while in Africa, the victory carries a different meaning: hope. At the height of the scramble of Africa, when European powers were dividing up the continent amongst themselves with alarming speed, an African power had not only resisted conquest, it had forced the European empire to retreat in humiliation. But wait, how? How had this happened? How had this African kingdom, facing the same imperial pressures like all its fallen and falling neighbors, managed to stand its ground, when all other African societies were surely falling? What had made such a victory possible? And after such a stunning triumph, could that independence truly endure? Ethiopia. Long before European powers invaded Africa and gathered to divide the continent among themselves, Ethiopia had already existed as an organized state for well over 1,500 years, standing as one of the oldest centers of power in the world. Its roots stretched deep into the ancient Kingdom of Aksum, a kingdom that had risen near the Red Sea and grown into one of the great powers of the ancient world. And from those early centuries, Ethiopia was not only a political kingdom, it was also a Christian kingdom. It had its own church, its own monarchy, its own traditions, and a wealth of memory around old and sacred kingships woven into the identity of the state itself. And by 1270, The Solomonic dynasty had risen to power, claiming descent from the ancient union of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Whether understood through faith, tradition, or political legitimacy, this claim became central to Ethiopia's imperial identity. It gave the monarch an even greater sacred and revered identity, and tied the state to a long memory of kingship, reaching far beyond the immediate pressures of the age. So when Europe later turned its eyes towards Africa, Ethiopia, as a kingdom and state, was not appearing for the first time. Europe had heard of it before. Between the 1300s and 1400s, stories of a powerful Christian kingdom in Africa has circulated across Europe, carrying with them the legend of Prester John, a mysterious distant Christian ruler believed by many Europeans to exist somewhere beyond the Islamic world. Over the years, this mysterious ruler became attached to Ethiopia in the European imagination. To Europeans, Ethiopia was a mysterious, distant and Christian kingdom known through legend, faith, and fragments of information. But imagination was one thing. Direct contact was another. It was in the late 1400s and the early 1500s the Portuguese envoys and travelers started reaching Ethiopia, seeking diplomatic ties and Christian alliance. This was one of the first major moments of direct contact between Europe and Ethiopia. But even then, Ethiopia maintained its sovereignty. It received these early Europeans as visitors, negotiated with them, and engaged with them as distant powers. From this engagement with Europeans, between 1541 and 1543, Ethiopia received Portuguese military assistance during the devastating wars against Ahmed Kragan and the forces of Adal Sultanate. In that period, Ethiopia was able to receive European soldiers and firearms as foreign help in a moment of crisis. But even then, European help did not become European domination of Ethiopia. Ethiopia would go on to survive the crisis, and through the centuries that followed, it remained outside of European control. Europeans had been able to contact Ethiopia, but had not actively sought to politically dominate it. And for a long time, it would remain that way. This pattern held until 1868, when Europe returned in a different form, as an invading army. This invasion rose out of a crisis when the then Emperor Yohannes II imprisoned several European missionaries, officials, and other foreign nationals in Ethiopia after being frustrated by what he saw as British indifference to his diplomatic appeals. And what started as a diplomatic standoff gradually escalated into an international incident, with Ethiopia eventually deciding to respond with force. So, in April 1868, British forces marched deep into the Ethiopian interior and advanced towards the Emperor's mountain fortress at Magadala, and there the confrontation reached its climax. British troops defeated Yohannes' forces and entered his fortress. Realizing defeat was inevitable, Emperor Yohannes II took his own life, bringing his reign to an end. The British had won. It was a severe blow to Ethiopia. However, fortunate for Ethiopia, Britain then had no immediate plan to annex Ethiopia to its empire. Maintaining control over such a vast and difficult terrain would have required a long-term military and administrative commitment that London was not prepared to undertake at the time. So, after destroying much of Magadala and completing their mission, the British forces withdrew from Ethiopia. But then, almost immediately after that incident, the world around Ethiopia began to change. The Suez Canal. In 1869, the Suez Canal opened, linking the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea. This became the main route for Europe to Asia. And suddenly, the Red Sea was no longer just a regional waterway. It became one of the most important corridors in the world, making the African lands around it very valuable to Europeans. The importance of the Suez Canal immediately placed Ethiopia and other communities in the Horn of Africa in a new position, strategic, watched, and highly desired by Europe for occupation and control. This desire was highly intensified in the early 1880s. These early 1880s came with a fever, a rush by European powers to grab colonies in Africa. It was at the height of Industrial Revolution, and colonies in Africa meant an uncontested source of raw materials and open markets for goods being churned out of European factories like never seen before. It was this surge that led to the 1894 and 1885 Berlin Conference, where European powers, sensing a potential collision between themselves, gathered to formulate principles that would guide the annexation of Africa. So, what had already begun as a competition for African colonies by mid-1885 was more organized, and like never before, more aggressive. European states were rushing to secure African territories before their rivals could, and thus, across the continent, the scramble intensified. So with the Suez Canal opening and the scramble for African territories by Europe in place, Ethiopia became one of the Africa's territories, drawing serious attention because of its position near the Red Sea and the Horn of Africa. And like never before, Ethiopia's long-standing autonomy was threatened. And as European armies moved through Africa, seizing colony after colony, the pressure was now approaching Ethiopia's region. And this time, the pressure was different. Europe was no longer only imagining Ethiopia from afar. To European eyes, the memory of 1868, Britain's defeat of Ethiopia, made it appear vulnerable, reachable, and possible to subdue. And with the scramble now moving towards the Horn, Ethiopia's long-standing independence had become a political reality that European powers increasingly sought to undermine, challenge, and ultimately bring under their control. Italy. By the early 1880s, Italy was still a young European state, newly unified and anxious to prove itself among the great powers of Europe. Britain had its empire, France had its empire, Portugal still held old possessions, small Belgium had seized the Congo, Germany too had entered the colonial race with growing force and eagerness. But young Italy was late. And to be late in the scramble for Africa was to risk being left with nothing. So Italy looked outward, searching for a place abroad where it too could plant its flag, extend its influence, and build prestige by claiming its own empire. And one region quickly drew its attention: the Red Sea. Since the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869, the Red Sea had become one of the most important corridors in the world, linking Europe to Asia and turning the lands around it into strategic zones. Whoever held positions along that route could influence trade, movement, military access, and imperial power. And for Italy, the Red Sea was not just strategic, it offered something more. It offered a doorway into the Horn of Africa, Africa itself. And so, in 1882, Italy made a decisive move. It took formal control of Assab, a port on the Red Sea coast, located in present-day Eritrea. It was not a sudden conquest. Assab had been acquired in 1869 by an Italian shipping company, Rubattino Navigation, from local sultans along the coast. And in 1882, the Italian government formally took over Rubattino's holdings. With that step, Assab became Italy's first official colonial possession in Africa. However, Assab was small and limited, still far too insignificant for a young European power desperate to rival Britain, France, Germany, Portugal, and Belgium in the race for colonies in Africa. So in February 1885, Italy made another decisive move. Still in present-day Eritrea, Italy took over another Red Sea port, Massawa. This was after Egyptian forces withdrew from the area due to Egypt's weakening influence in the region. Massawa was better positioned for trade, military movement, and offered better access into the interior of Africa. It was older and considered far more important by European powers. Unlike Assab, Massawa gave Italy a stronger regional presence and a real base from which it could look beyond the coast towards Africa's interior. And to Africa's interior, Italy looked with eagerness. It increased its military presence and began moving its forces in the region, strengthening their positions and actively pushing beyond the coastline, establishing themselves in areas that brought them closer and closer to Ethiopia's border. And Ethiopia noticed. To Ethiopia, this was not a harmless European presence along the sea. It was an expansion by European power intended to eventually undermine Ethiopian autonomy and influence. And Ethiopia was not going to sit, watch, and wait for Italy to invade its borders. Ethiopia alerted its forces, moved them towards the north of Ethiopia to mount Italy's movements along its borders, and be ready to move should Italy dare to get too close. And this tension grew when Italian forces moved further inland and occupied Sati, a location outside of Massawa. To Ethiopian commanders in the north of Ethiopia, this was an alarming sign. Italy was no longer simply watching from the coast, it was probing deeper. And that probing would lead to the first confrontation between Italy and Ethiopia. On January 26, 1887, near a place called Dogali, in the present-day Eritrea, and close to Ethiopia's northern frontier, Ethiopian forces under the command of Ras Alula ambushed Italian forces where they moved to support the Italian position at Sati. It was a devastating defeat for Italy. The Italian forces were overwhelmed and many of their soldiers were killed. When news of the defeat reached Italy, it was humiliating. Italy had entered the Horn of Africa expecting to build an empire, and it had not anticipated that an African power would stand in its way. It was a warning. Ethiopia was not going to be easily taken. However, Italy was desperate. It needed to make its mark in the region and was not about to be stopped. It would carry on with its ambitions. And while Italy was trying to recover from the defeat at Dogali, Ethiopia itself was entering a moment of internal power change. In March 1889, Ethiopia lost its Emperor Yohannes IV. He had been mortally wounded while fighting the Mahdist forces in Sudan and died shortly afterward. It was a moment of uncertainty. Yohannes had been a strong and powerful emperor, an influential figure in the region. His death was badly timed, especially with Italy at Ethiopia's borders. Suddenly, Ethiopia stood at a moment of succession, a moment of crisis. A powerful ruler had fallen. The imperial throne had to be climbed. And for Italy, this was an opportunity. But then, a new Ethiopian figure rose to the occasion to fill the gap left by the fallen emperor, Menelik II. Menelik II was not an unknown figure in Ethiopia. He had long ruled Shewa, one of Ethiopia's most powerful regions. And by the time Yohannes died, Menelik had already built himself into one of the strongest men in the empire. From his wealth of leadership experience, he was patient. He understood negotiation, timing, and weapons of warfare. He studied and understood that the world around Ethiopia was changing, and that survival would require more than bravery. On 25th March 1889, Menelik declared himself Emperor of Ethiopia. And with his rise, Italy sought a new opening. Seeing Menelik's rise to fill the power vacuum and still carrying the memory of defeat by Ethiopia, Italy understood that direct confrontation would not be simple. It would have to devise other means, diplomacy. And Menelik II too had reasons to engage. He was a new emperor in urgent need of recognition. He needed weapons to defend his territory. He needed money and resources to consolidate his position. He needed diplomatic relations with powerful states, especially at a time when European powers were closing in on Africa, conquering African territory after African territory. So on May 2nd, 1889, shortly after Menelik II had taken over as Emperor of Ethiopia, Italy stepped forward, seeking diplomatic relations with Ethiopia, a friendship deal. Italy wanted Ethiopia to recognize its claims in the north of Ethiopia. After negotiations, Menelik II and representatives of Italy signed the Treaty of Wuchale on May 2nd, 1889. At first, the treaty appeared to be an agreement of friendship and mutual understanding. Italy had agreed to provide money, weapons, diplomatic support to Ethiopia, while Menelik II would gain resources useful for strengthening his rule. And Italy, in turn, would receive recognition of its claims over territories in the north, strengthening its foothold along the Red Sea. To Menelik II and his advisors, the Treaty of Wuchale with Italy was an agreement between two sovereign powers seeking diplomatic ties on equal terms. But to Italy, it was more, a legal claim over the sovereignty of Ethiopia. This controversy and misunderstanding lay in Article 17 of the treaty. In the Amharic version, the official language of Ethiopia, Menelik II could use the Italian government in his dealings with other foreign powers if he wished. The requirement was optional, and it preserved Ethiopian sovereignty. But in the Italian version, the wording was different. There, Article 17 required Ethiopia to conduct all its foreign affairs through Italy. This was not a small difference. Italy was laying claim to Ethiopia's sovereignty, sticking to its own version of the treaty. And between 1889 and 1893, Italy went around Europe and the outside world presenting Ethiopia as an Italian protectorate, a state supposedly under Italian authority. It claimed that Ethiopia had accepted Italian authority in all its foreign affairs. To European powers, it was as though Ethiopia had placed itself under Italian protection. And Menelik II soon discovered the deception. A treaty that had appeared to offer friendship was being used to undermine his authority and Ethiopian independence. Italy was trying, with a stroke of the pen, to take control of Ethiopia. And before Menelik II could decide the next course of action, on January 1st, 1890, Italy formally established the colony of Eritrea. This firmly placed Italy as a major force in the Horn of Africa, right at the doorstep of Ethiopia. This was a direct threat to Ethiopia. Italy's formal establishment of Eritrea as a colony meant Italy now had a colonial base, a platform from which it could press southward, exert pressure on Ethiopia's independence. But Menelik II was watching. He understood the looming danger. Italy was soon going to come invading. He had to prepare, and he began preparing. But first, he had to send a message, making it clear that Ethiopia was still a sovereign state, with him as the supreme leader of Ethiopia, not Italy. So in September 1890, Menelik II officially rejected Italy's claim that Ethiopia was its protectorate. He denied that Ethiopia had surrendered control over its foreign affairs. He insisted that the treaty had not made Ethiopia subject to Italy. But Italy was stubborn. It refused to abandon its claim. It continued to insist on its version, announcing to the world that Ethiopia was under its control. But Menelik II was adamant. He was not going to succumb to Italian pressure. Ethiopia was and would remain an independent African territory without any outside force dominating it. In 1891, Menelik II sent out an official communication to all European powers, asserting Ethiopia's sovereignty, making it clear that Ethiopia did not accept Italian control. This was not only a message to Italy, it was a message to Europe itself. Ethiopia was not a protectorate. Ethiopia was not available. Ethiopia would speak for itself. But Italy still would not yield. Between 1890 and 1893, having protested Article 17 of the Treaty of Wuchale, which required him to conduct Ethiopia's foreign relations through Italy, he started to actively build and solidify the military strength of Ethiopia. Menelik II purchased rifles and artillery from abroad. He reached out and created diplomatic ties with other European powers, such as France, Russia, and Britain. Through these diplomatic ties, he made sure that Ethiopia was not isolated while refusing to accept Italy's claim. It was clear the conflict would only be determined through military confrontation. And in 1894, tensions along the northern border of Ethiopia intensified. Italy strengthened its positions along Eritrea. This border region became a focal point for local resistance by Ethiopia, as Italian pressure began to turn the region into a field of confrontation. By December 1894, the crisis had deteriorated. Italian forces had gathered and positioned themselves along the northern border of Ethiopia. By the dawn of 1895, it was clear there would be an Italo-Ethiopian war. Italian forces operating from Eritrea were moving deeper into the contested border zones, pressing southward. And Ethiopian forces were not backing down, they were gathering, pressing northwards. By late 1895, the dispute had clearly moved beyond words. There was no backing down. The Treaty of Wuchale had been denounced. Italy's claim over Ethiopia had been rejected. Italian forces were pressing south from Eritrea, and Ethiopian forces were gathering, moving northwards to meet them. The confrontation that had begun with coastal footholds on the Red Sea had now become an open war, and Menelik II understood what was at stake. Italy was not going to back down. This was no longer only a border dispute. It was no longer only about Italy's deceptive treaty. The independence of Ethiopia hung in the balance. If Italy succeeded, Ethiopia would be forced into the same fate that had already befallen so much of Africa and was still spreading across the continent. Its sovereignty would be placed under European authority. And Menelik II was determined that this would not be the fate of Ethiopia, a state that for centuries had managed its own affairs. And so Menelik moved. On September 17, 1895, he issued a call for national mobilization. It was an urgent call. The call went across Ethiopia. All regional rulers were summoned. Warriors, forces from different parts of Ethiopian empire were all ordered to gather and be ready to march. Menelik was not preparing for a small frontier clash. He was calling Ethiopia into a national war for survival. And the response was massive. From Shewa, from Gojam, from Tigray, from Wollo, from Harar, from different regions and houses of power, Ethiopian forces began to move. Old rivalries and local divisions within Ethiopia itself were for that moment placed aside to fight for Ethiopia's independence. So, through late 1895, Ethiopian forces trekked north towards the southern Eritrean border where Italian forces were starting to gather. The first major confrontation would come at a place called Amba, Alagi, on December 7, 1895. Amba Alagi was located on a mountain position in Tigray. It was a high and difficult place, standing along the route of Italy's advance. To Italy, Amba Alagi had seemed a forward position, a place from which its forces could hold ground and project confidence well inside Ethiopian territory. Here, at Amba Alagi, the Italian forces were under Major Pietro Tosselli. But there was a problem. And by the time Major Tosselli and his Italian troops realized it, it was just too late. Major Tosselli's troops were holding an exposed position. They were separated from the deeper Italian base of strength. They had pushed far too forward into enemy territory. And before they could draw back, the Ethiopian army was upon them, in far greater numbers than the Italians had expected. Ethiopian forces under Ras Makonnen and Ras Mengeshe Yohannes moved against the Italian position, already isolated and outnumbered. The Italian forces stood on difficult ground. It was a desperate moment. Ethiopian forces, realizing their advantage, pressed in from the surrounding slopes and heights, closing in, bringing their numbers and momentum against Tosselli's men. The Italian line could not hold. Within moments, it collapsed. On that day, December 7th, 1895, Major Tosselli was killed, along with many of his men, and most of the survivors were wounded. The Italian camp at Amba Alagi had fallen. Italy was humiliated. It was the first major battle shock of the war. The Italian defeat at Amba Alagi was a major blow to Italian confidence. Ethiopia had shown again that it could hold and defend its lands, that its independence would not be overstepped. It was a state that could gather force, strike back, and destroy an exposed enemy position. But Italy was equally determined. Even with the defeat of Amba Alagi, it was not going to walk away. It maintained its camps and refused to draw back from the advancing Ethiopian forces. Ethiopia was committed too. Its forces shifted attention to the next Italian fort, Mekelle. Mekelle was a key town in Tigray, and just outside it, Italian forces had camped and held a fortified position at Enda Jesus Hill. This fort was under Major Giuseppe Galliano. It became clear that this would be the next place where the war would be decided. With one victory already in hand, Ethiopia was confident. Starting in late December 1895 and early January 1896, Ethiopian forces began tightening around the Italian position at Mekelle, under the command of Ras Makonnen, and Menelik himself soon arrived with a larger imperial army. But there was a problem for the Ethiopian army. Unlike at Amba Alagi, the Italian fort at Mekelle was well defended. It had walls, and the Italians defending them had far superior weapons. A direct attack would be deadly, even for the strong Ethiopian force. At first, direct attempts against the fort were costly. Ethiopia needed a new strategy. The longer Italian forces stayed at Mekelle, the stronger they became. Ethiopia was desperate, and Empress Taytu Betul, Menelik's wife, had an idea. She stepped forward. The Empress had marched with Menelik and his imperial army. She was not merely present as the emperor's wife. She understood politics and strategy. And at Mekelle, her role was crucial. So, instead of direct attack, which was clearly not going to work, she advised a different approach. Cut the source of Italian fort survival: water. And around January 9th, 1896, men from Empress Taytu's contingent cut off the water supply feeding the Italian fort. The water stream feeding the camp was placed under Ethiopian control. When the Italians attempted to regain access to the water stream, Ethiopian forces successfully repelled them. The siege of the Italian fort at Mekelle was complete. The Italians still had their fort, but without a water supply, it was becoming a death trap. The Italian forces tried to hold it, but the thirst caused by the water shortage only grew worse. Reinforcements to drive away the Ethiopian forces gathering outside the camp were uncertain. It was a desperate moment. The fort had quickly become a weak link for the Italians. The Ethiopians waited outside, and their forces grew stronger. And just after 10 days of Ethiopians cutting off the water supply for the Italian camp, on January 19th, 1886, Major Galliano raised a white flag. The Italians were surrendering the fort. And on January 21st, 1886, the Italian garrison was allowed to leave after surrendering the fort. Menelik permitted the Italians to withdraw, a decision that showed confidence. Ethiopia had not only beaten them, it had shown that it could control the terms of war. But still, Italy did not accept defeat. Its forces kept gathering. Its government did not abandon its colonial claim of Ethiopia. The humiliation of Amba, Alagi, and Mekelle had proved not enough to end Italian colonial ambitions. But Ethiopia was determined. Through late January and February 1896, Ethiopia mobilized more forces. More Ethiopian troops arrived in the north of Ethiopia. By the end of the national mobilization, Ethiopia had gathered one of the largest African armies of the 19th century in the northern highlands. And for Italy, this was a problem. The general commanding the Italian forces was not only facing pressure from the Ethiopian army, political pressure from Rome was also at his heels. In Rome, they wanted Ethiopian forces defeated once and for all, and as soon as possible. And Italian Prime Minister Francesco Crispi wanted victory. Italian pride was on the line. By February 1896, the Italian command was trapped between military caution and political pressure. Some within the command understood Ethiopia's military strength, urged caution. Amidst the pressures, supplies were strained. Morale for Italian forces was dying. The Ethiopian army was close. The longer Italy waited, the more impossible its position seemed. Faced with all these pressures, Italy decided to make its move. The Ethiopian army had made camp near a place known as Adwa. In order to catch the Ethiopian army by surprise, the Italian commander, General Baratieri, came up with a plan. His army would advance in separate brigades, moving through the night to occupy strong positions overlooking the Ethiopian camp near Adwa by dawn. If the plan worked, the Italians could take a high ground, force Menelik into a difficult position, and perhaps restore Italy's campaign in one decisive stroke. Adwa. Adwa lay in the rugged highlands of Tigray, surrounded by broken ground, ridges, valleys, hills, and narrow paths. It was not an open, flat country where European formations could move easily in neat lines. It was a difficult terrain, cut by heights and ravines, a place where distance could deceive and army columns could easily separate from each other and lose sight of one another. But with ongoing pressure, Italy had no choice. It would advance. And on the night of February 29, 1896, at about 9 p.m., Italian forces began moving. The army brigades had to move through difficult terrain at night. For their plan to work, they had to keep direction, remain close enough to support one another, and reach their intended positions without being confused by the terrain or noticed by Ethiopian forces. But Adwa's terrain gave no guarantees. That night, it was dark, and given the rough terrain, movement was difficult. Italian maps and directions failed to match the reality of the ground. It was bad for Italy. By the early hours of March 1st, 1896, the Italian movement had already gone wrong. Their army brigades had separated. One brigade had moved too far, another lost contact. Units that were supposed to support one another were no longer where they needed to be. The Italian plan, which had depended on coordination, was breaking apart even before the full battle had begun. And to their surprise, the Ethiopian army was waiting. The Italians' movement had not gone unnoticed. Ethiopian scouts and commanders understood the movement of the Italians. They understood the terrain, and once the separated Italian formations came into reach, the Ethiopian army began to advance upon them. The Italian army, which was supposed to fight as one, had been broken by the terrain into small fragments. It was too late. They were exposed and could not retreat. It was the brigade under General Matteo Alberton that became one of the first to face the full force of the Ethiopian attack. It had moved forward and become exposed. Ethiopian forces closed in, striking with numbers, speed, and intensity. The Italian army and its colonial troops stood their ground, but were cut off from the support that was supposed to reinforce them. And as the pressure mounted, Alberton's brigade was overwhelmed, and he, the commander, was captured. This was the first major break. As the fighting spread across the rugged terrain around Adwa, Ethiopian forces attacked across multiple fronts. The Italian brigades, separated and lost across the highlands, were being found isolated and struck separately, one by one. The Italian army was overwhelmed. Italian soldiers were being killed in large numbers. Others were being captured. Others fled across the difficult terrain, trying to escape the battlefield as the Ethiopian attack overwhelmed their army. By the end of the day, the Italian army had collapsed. Thousands had been killed, thousands captured. Others had been routed, scattered, and driven back to Eritrea. Italy's campaign to impose control over Ethiopia had been destroyed on the battlefield. This was not a minor colonial setback. This was one of the greatest defeats suffered by European colonial army in Africa. At Adwa, Ethiopia again had prevailed, and this time convincingly. News of the defeat at Adwa did not stay in the highlands for long. It soon reached Europe. In Rome, it was shocking. Reports confirmed what many had feared. The Italian army had been crushed. The reaction in Italy was immediate. The government faced outrage, disbelief, and humiliation. The promise of a swift colonial victory had collapsed into one of the most devastating defeats suffered by European power in Africa. Public anger rose, political pressure intensified, and it became clear that the war could not continue. Italy had no choice but to seek peace. Italy gathered envoys and sent them back to meet Emperor Menelik II. This time, the tone had changed. Italy came as a defeated power, seeking terms. Menelik received them from a position of strength. Negotiations followed, focused on ending the war and settling the question that had caused it. The outcome was decisive. On October 26, 1886, in Addis Ababa, the Treaty of Addis Ababa was signed. Italy formally recognized Ethiopia as an independent and sovereign state. The Treaty of Wuchale was set aside. The claim that Ethiopia was under Italian protectorate was abandoned. The war was over. Ethiopia had not only defeated the European army on the battlefield, it had secured its independence in writing. But Ethiopia's independence still hung in the balance. Across Africa, the colonial advance was still moving. European powers were still expanding, capturing colony after colony, and drawing borders around territories they had seized. The scramble for Africa was at its height. Ethiopia had defended its independence against one European power, but several European powers still had ambitions to reign over Ethiopia. It had to preserve its independence or fall to other powers. And this was not going to be easy. Ethiopia knew this far too well. It could only fight and win so many battles. Its final victory could not be secured on the battlefield. If politically Ethiopia remained isolated, Europe could still surround it, pressure it, weaken it, or wait for another vulnerable moment. So, for Menelik II, after the defeat of Italy in 1896, he did not rush to celebrate. The battle was far from over. Real victory for him meant recognition of Ethiopia's independence by all European powers. So after Adwa, Menelik turned to diplomacy. In the early 1900s, Menelik II sent envoys and opened negotiations with other European powers, especially Britain and France. Both Britain and France had colonial territories bordering Ethiopia, and to Menelik, it was crucial that these two powers formally recognize and accept to deal with Ethiopia as an independent state. He promised that as long as they recognize Ethiopia as an independent state, Ethiopia would in turn recognize their colonial territories as demarcated along Ethiopia's borders. And they agreed. At this point, the defeat of Italy by Ethiopia had convinced them that Ethiopia would not be taken for granted. And so, by the end of 1908, Italy, Britain, and France had all entered agreements that treated Ethiopia as an independent African state. Their ambitions had not vanished from the region, but Ethiopia itself had become too costly and too complicated to colonize. Through the early 1900s into the early 1920s, Ethiopia remained the only ancient African state that had fought off European conquest, defeated the European colonial army, and preserved its sovereignty while all its neighbors were colonized. And in 1923, Ethiopia was accepted in the League of Nations. This further cemented Ethiopia's sovereignty in the international order. But Italy could not forget. To Italy, Adwa remained a symbol of humiliation. Despite its treaty with Ethiopia, recognizing it as an independent state, Decades later, Italy would invade again. In 1935, Italy, now under Benito Mussolini, invaded Ethiopia again. This was at the height of fascist Italy. Armed with modern weapons and determined to erase the humiliation of Adwa in 1896, the invasion was brutal. Italy came with aircraft, modern artillery, mechanized forces, and chemical weapons. Ethiopia again resisted, but it faced an overwhelming modern force. In 1936, Ethiopia's defense fell and Italian forces entered Addis Ababa. Ethiopia's independence was temporarily broken, and Mussolini declared Ethiopia part of Italian East Africa. Italy tried to turn the country it had failed to conquer in 1896 into a colonial possession. It was a dark moment for Ethiopia's sovereignty, but even then, Ethiopia refused to give in. This time, Emperor Haile Selassie went into exile, where he continued to speak and campaign for Ethiopia before the world. Inside Ethiopia, patriots continued to resist Italian rule. Ethiopian resistance fighters continued to fight from the mountains, countryside, and occupied regions. Italy had only taken the capital, but it had not crushed the Ethiopian will to resist. And from 1936 to 1941, Ethiopian resistance against the Italian occupation continued. And in 1941, the tide turned. Italian forces in East Africa were defeated by a combination of Ethiopian resistance fighters and allied troops led by British during the Second World War. Emperor Haile Selassie returned to Ethiopia. Ethiopian sovereignty was restored. Italy, again, could not prevail over Ethiopia. And when the 1950s and 1960s arrived, with the rest of Africa marching to independence, crying free at last from Europe's colonial domination, Ethiopia's story was different. It had prevailed.